Good afternoon. Oh, hello. I'm David Ferriero, Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to the William G. McGowan Theater here at the National Archives. Whether you're here in the theater or watching us on YouTube, we're glad you could join us for today's discussion of the new book, Stanton, Lincoln's War Secretary, with award-winning author Walter Stahr. Before we get started, I want to tell you about two other programs coming up here at the McGowan Theater. On Wednesday, September 6th at noon, please join us for the program Writer, Sailor, Soldier, Spy, Ernest Hemingway's Secret Adventures from 1935 to 1961. While author Nicholas Reynolds was historian at the CIA Museum in 2010, he began to uncover clues suggesting that novelist Ernest Hemingway was deeply involved in mid-20th century spycraft. In Writer, Sailor, Soldier, Spy, Reynolds reveals for the first time the whole story of this hidden side of Hemingway's life that reads like an espionage thriller. Book signing will follow the program. In conjunction with Hispanic Heritage Month, we proudly present the program An American Experience, A Class Apart, on Thursday, September 7th at noon, built around the landmark 1954 case, Hernandez versus Texas. The hour-long film interweaves the stories of its central characters with a broader story of the civil rights movement. It also brings to life the heroic post-World War II struggle of Mexican Americans fighting to dismantle the discrimination targeted against them. To learn more about these and all of our programs and exhibitions, consult our monthly calendar of events in print or online at archives.gov. There are copies in the lobby as well as a sign-up sheet where you can receive it by regular mail or email. Of the crucial men close to President Lincoln, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton was the most powerful and controversial. Stanton raised, armed, and supervised the army of 1 million men who won the Civil War. He organized the war effort, directed military movements from his telegraph office, where Lincoln literally hung out with him. He arrested and imprisoned thousands for war crimes, such as resisting the draft or calling for an armistice. Stanton was so controversial that some accused him at that time of complicity in Lincoln's assassination. He was a stubborn genius who was both reviled and revered in his time. Reviewing Stanton, Harold Holzer in the Wall Street Journal writes, "This exhaustively researched, well-paced book should take its place as the new standard biography of the ill-tempered man who helped save the Union. It is fair, judicious, authoritative, and comprehensive." Ron Chernow calls Stahr's book fair-minded, rigorous, and scrupulously honest, balancing his sometimes questionable record on civil liberties with the logistical wizardry that he applied to win the Union war effort. And Larry Matthews in the Washington Independent Review of Books says, "There are many biographies of Stanton, but Stahr's will stand out as one of the finest and most detailed. This is a book for both scholars of Civil War history and general readers who have a deep interest in that period." Walter Stahr is no stranger to the National Archives. He has graced our stage with all three of his books, and before that on a panel discussion, and most importantly, has drawn on the records housed here in our facilities for his research. He said, and this is a direct quote, which I love, "Libraries store the raw material of history. One simply cannot write history books without libraries and good librarians who work there." Here at the National Archives, we proudly preserve the permanent records of the federal government and make them accessible to all. After graduating from Harvard Law School in 1982, Walter Stahr joined the Washington office of an international law firm, Cleary, Gottlieb, Steen, and Hamilton. In 1986 was posted to Hong Kong, where he worked for 3 years on international litigations. In 1990, he joined the Securities and Exchange Commission and worked for several years in the chairman's office, writing speeches and congressional testimony and advising on enforcement cases. In 1995, he joined Fidelity Investments to be their first internal lawyer based in Hong Kong, where his work and travels took him throughout Asia, especially to Japan and Taiwan. And when he returned to Washington in 1999, he joined Emerging Markets Partnership, an internal law, as an internal lawyer, focusing on Asia, and where he eventually rose to be the general counsel. In addition to Stanton, he's the author of John Jay, Founding Father, and Seward, Lincoln's Indispensable Man. Please welcome Walter Stahr.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. It is so exciting to be here in this building, which houses some of the critical records on which I based the book, and to be back in Washington where so much of the Stanton story takes place, and to have the book finally in print. So, who was Edwin Stanton? Why was he important? Why was he interesting? Stanton, as you just heard, was the Secretary of War for the North during the Civil War. He was Lincoln's military right hand, the man Lincoln referred to in jest as his Mars. And together in Stanton's telegraph office, because there was no telegraph equipment in the White House, the two of them directed the generals, received the reports from the battlefield, corresponded with governors and average citizens, made the decisions about how to run the war. Stanton was also the Secretary of War immediately after Lincoln's death, running through the first several years of Reconstruction. So it was Stanton who organized the manhunt to find those who had killed the president, and organized the military commission that tried them here in Washington, and the execution of 4 of them. It was Stanton who turned the Union Army from a fighting force into an army of occupation in the South. And so now, in his telegraph office, the daily reports were not about battles, they were about gunshots and rapes and murders in the South. And reading these reports, Stanton believed the Army had to stay in the South. President Andrew Johnson believed just as firmly that the Army had to leave the South, and it was the conflict between them that led to Johnson's attempt to remove Stanton, which in turn led to the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. So if you're interested in impeachment, and some people are these days, you really can't understand the first impeachment of an American president without understanding Stanton, because he was the cause. He was the guy that the president was determined to get rid of. So that's why he's important, but why is he interesting? Some of you may have heard a rumor that he was a lawyer, and I have to confess, he was. So by definition, a lawyer can't be interesting. A few days after Stanton died, George Templeton Strong, the famous New York diarist, wrote that good and evil were strangely blended in the character of this great war minister. He was honest, patriotic, able, indefatigable, warm-hearted, unselfish, incorruptible, arbitrary, capricious, tyrannical, vindictive, hateful, and cruel. I think that George Templeton Strong had it about right. I think that all of those adjectives apply to Edwin Stanton, and that he was a curious mixture of good and evil. And that's what makes him such a fascinating, difficult subject for a biographer, and that's what I hope makes him an interesting subject for the reader. So let's back up a bit. Where was he born? What was his family situation? What did he do for a living? He was born in Steubenville, Ohio, on the banks of the Ohio River in December of 1814. His father died when Edwin was only 13 years old. Money was very tight, and so his mother put him to work in a bookstore. One person remembered that he was a good employee with one minor fault. He would be so busy reading his book that when you entered the store and needed help, he didn't notice you. Money was tight, and so he was only able to go to college for 3 terms, to Kenyon College in Ohio, and then he read law, as one did in those days. There essentially were no law schools, so he read law with a lawyer in Steubenville to become a lawyer. He rapidly succeeded as a lawyer, and he also was very active in politics, pretty much from the time he was 21. He was a die-hard Democrat, not a candidate for office very often. He was a candidate only once for the office of county prosecutor. But he gave political speeches, he organized rallies, he wrote resolutions, he went to conventions. I think there's a great book to be written about how the energy that we devote to professional sports was focused on politics in the early 19th century. Because there were no professional sports. People identified themselves not as a Redskins fan, but as a anti-bank Democrat. On the family side, he married relatively young Mary Lamson, a woman whom he met through church. They had 2 children, but then a succession of tragedies. Their year-old daughter died, and then 2 years later, Stanton's wife, Mary, died. And then 2 years later, Stanton's beloved brother, Darwin, commits suicide. He's using his scalpel in a fit of madness. And so even before the Civil War, when he's in the War Department receiving daily reports of death, death is a major part of Stanton's life. Leaving his young son behind in the care of his family, Stanton moves to Pittsburgh in 1848. He's tired of sort of small-town law. He wants to try something bigger and more difficult. Pittsburgh at the time is a booming, dark, dirty industrial center, with the population increasing rapidly, and there's lots of legal work to do. His most famous case involves the Wheeling Bridge, a bridge across from the Ohio River from Wheeling into Ohio. From the perspective of the residents of Pittsburgh, that was a problem because their interstate highway, if you will, was the Ohio River. That was their lifeline to Cincinnati and the world. And they were concerned that with this new bridge, the tallest steamboats would not be able to get up the Ohio River, and Pittsburgh would be starved, and Wheeling would become the sort of center of everything. So Pittsburgh persuaded the state of Pennsylvania to file suit against the bridge company, and Stanton was the principal lawyer for the state of Pennsylvania. And the case, as the New York Times reviewer said, it was a little bit like an American Jarndyce versus Jarndyce. It went on forever and ever, and people sort of lived and died, and the case was still going on. He came here several times to Washington, to the Supreme Court, to argue different aspects of the case, and in a sense he lost. The last decision in the Supreme Court was against him. And in another sense he lost. You can go to Wheeling, West Virginia today, and the damn bridge, from his perspective, is still there. It's a national landmark, for heaven's sakes. But in another sense he won, because the steamboats continued to go up and down the river. What the city fathers of Pittsburgh feared in terms of the city being choked off didn't happen. Not long after he moved to Pittsburgh, he met Ellen Hutchison, the daughter of a merchant. And here is the first place the archives comes into the story, because here, in this building, in a vault somewhere upstairs, are the love letters that Edwin wrote to Ellen before they were married. So you think of this building as housing merely kind of official government documents. These are not official government documents. They were donated by a descendant, but they are here. And I wanted to give you some sense of the riches of what's here. I wanted to read you some quotations from these letters. So in December of '54, he writes to her from Washington describing a dinner party. It was chiefly a gentleman's party, and they were excessively stupid generally. While ladies are present, the conversation is usually upon general or interesting topics, but after their departure, wine and cigars, drinking and eating, and politics, neither elevating nor refining in their tendency ensue. I would never attend such assemblages if it could be avoided. I cannot but contrast the sensations produced by such associations with the feelings after spending some length of time with a cultivated and refined woman like yourself, dear Ellen. In September of 1855, he went to Cincinnati to be part of a legal team that included Abraham Lincoln. And here is one of the letters that's here in the archives from Cincinnati. Last evening, I was very anxious for Mr. Harding, another of the lawyers, had been unwell several days, and I was apprehensive he would not be able to be in court so that the scientific part of the case, which I had given no attention to, would also fall upon me. Accordingly, by sitting up all night, I got ready for it. This morning, however, he was much better and acquitted himself so admirably that a great burden is taken from me. One of the things that many people know about Edwin Stanton is that he was rude to Abraham Lincoln in Cincinnati when they first met. The sources for that, however, are generally memoirs from 25 and 35 years later from folks who weren't there, who said things like, well, my uncle told me that, ... So although Stanton was often rude, I'm not sure that he was rude to Lincoln on that occasion. One more quote for one of these letters. This is on the morning that Edwin and Ellen got married. I salute you with assurances of deep and devoted love that this evening will be attested by solemn vows before the world and in the presence of God. With calm and joyful hope, disturbed by no conflicting feeling, quiet and peaceful, I await the happy hour that shall witness our union, to be thereafter parted no more till death part us, living only for each other, you a true and loving wife to me, I a true and devoted husband to you. So, when someone says that they only have boring official records at the National Archives, you tell them that they actually have love letters. After they got married, the Stantons moved here to Washington, probably so that Edwin could pursue his Supreme Court practice. He started to do some work for the federal government, and the Attorney General, Jeremiah Black, asked him to go to California. The federal government has some major land cases there, and Black felt that he needed someone on the ground to represent the United States. Stanton agreed, got on the boat, went to California, successfully represented the interests of the United States in some major cases, including one in which sort of half of San Francisco was at issue. This is another place where the archives comes into the picture because the records of the Attorney General provided some of the interesting little details. Stanton's reports back to Black's instructions to Stanton out in California. He returns here to Washington just in time to serve as one of the defense lawyers in perhaps one of the most fascinating trials in Washington history, in which Congressman Dan Sickles, in broad daylight, just up in Lafayette Square, shoots and kills the son of Francis Scott Key. Stanton and the other defense lawyers get him off, the main reason being that the deceased was having a love affair with the wife of the killer. Stanton argued that by shooting a man sleeping with your wife, you are acting in self-defense. I'm not kidding you. It's and again, it's so exciting to be right here where so much of the story takes place. I mean, it's just up the block at the courthouse that takes place. Briefly, Stanton is the Attorney General under President James Buchanan just before Lincoln becomes president. He takes part in the cabinet debates about what to do about Fort Sumter. And then he goes back to his private law practice during the first months of the Lincoln presidency. He's quite critical of Lincoln in private letters to Buchanan and others, in one of them saying that there's no sign of any intelligent understanding by Lincoln or the crew that groom him of the state of the country or the exigencies of the time. Bluster and bravura alternate with timidity and despair, recklessness and hopelessness by turn rule the hour. What but disgrace and disaster can happen? So he was not a fan of Abraham Lincoln, to say the least. And yet, a couple months later, when Lincoln needs a new Secretary of War, he turns to Stanton. Why? Partly it was politics. He wanted to show that this was not a Republican war, that this was a Union war, and that Democrats like Stanton were welcome and indeed encouraged to play their part in defeating the Confederacy. Partly it was that Stanton had a reputation, built in part in California, as hardworking, diligent, determined, And that was what Lincoln was looking for in a new Secretary of War. He soon proved his reputation right. One of the first things he accomplished was getting legislation passed that gave the federal government control over the railroads and telegraphs. Lincoln and Stanton could have used that in order to nationalize the railroads, but that wasn't what they had in mind. Stanton brought the railroad executives here to the War Department, and he said, look, we will work with you. You can remain private companies, but you're going to have to basically take orders, in some cases, from the War Department and charge us low rates. That's how it worked. The most dramatic example of Stanton using the rails and telegraphs comes in the fall of '63, when General Rosecrans and 30,000 Federals are threatened in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And Stanton summons Lincoln in from the soldiers' home where he's spending the night, and others to the War Department, and says, look, I would like to move in a week's time 20,000 troops from Northern Virginia, where they're not doing much good, and move them all the way to Chattanooga. And Lincoln laughs and says, ha! It would take you a week's time, Stanton, to get them the 30 miles from Northern Virginia into D.C. What are you talking about? And Stanton is not amused. He says this situation is far too serious for jokes. And he and others work on Lincoln a bit over some oysters at midnight, and they persuade him to allow Stanton to try. And Stanton then spends the next that night and the next couple nights in the War Department handling the details. I mean, it's almost impossible. You're moving 20,000 men more than 1,200 miles using about 8 different rail lines, some of them with different rail gauges. You have to get them across the Ohio River twice where there are no rail bridges, so you've got to organize boats or something to get them across the Ohio River. You have to worry about the possibility of Confederate raids and information security, but through a sort of Herculean effort, Stanton manages. The troops get to Chattanooga in time, Chattanooga is saved, and then those same troops become part of the force that marches the next year on Atlanta. The archives was again critical in my research in this part of the story. They have, right here in this building, the original outgoing telegrams of the Secretary of War. Many of these are in Stanton's own handwriting. You know, he didn't sit down to type an email the way we would. No, I mean, he sat down with a piece of paper and a pen and wrote out what he wanted to say to a railroad agent in Grafton, Maryland, or the man watching the height of the Ohio River out at the border. And then the clerk would take it and tap it into the telegraph, but Stanton very carefully preserved every single outgoing telegram in a file, and that was really the backbone of my research of this part of the story, because yes, much of that has now been printed in the official records, but much of it has not. Some of the really sort of interesting telegrams, for some reason, haven't made their way into the printed record, but they are here in the archives available for use on what's called M473, a microfilm publication. So I've talked some about Stanton the efficient. What about Stanton the tyrannical? Let's hear some about that. Well, let's talk about General Charles Stone, a West Point graduate. Not long after Stanton becomes Secretary of War, he starts to get complaints from Congress about Stone. And Stanton arranges to have General Stone arrested at midnight here in Washington, carted off to a remote fort, held in solitary confinement. And Stone writes letter after letter saying that he would like to know what the charges are against him, and face those charges in a court-martial. There is never a court-martial. Basically, Stanton holds Stone until Congress passes a law that could be summarized, release Stone. Another example, Dennis Mahoney. Mahoney is the editor of an anti-administration newspaper in Dubuque, Iowa. And when Stanton issues an order authorizing and encouraging the arrest of those who are discouraging enlistments, the local folks in Dubuque arrest him. So Stanton doesn't actually order the arrest, but Stanton effectively has the keys. He can let him out anytime. The local Democrats nominate Mahoney for Congress as a way of highlighting his plight. Stanton responds by keeping him in jail until after the election. The next year, Mahoney writes a book about his experiences, and he dedicates it to Stanton, saying that Stanton had earned the honor through his acts of outrage, tyranny, and despotism. Yeah. So what was Stanton's relationship with Abraham Lincoln? In some sense, they're similar. They're both lawyers from the Midwest. They're both anti-slavery. In some sense, they're, of course, dramatically different. Lincoln is kind and considerate, and Stanton is rude and inconsiderate. There's a great scene in Spielberg's Lincoln movie. It's set in Stanton's telegraph office. Lincoln, after reading some messages, is sitting there with some admiring aides nearby, and Stanton can just feel it, and he turns to Lincoln and he says, "You're going to tell another one of your stories." "I don't have time for one of your stories, Mr. President." And then he spins around to an aide and demands the statistics regarding some aspect of a transportation problem. And I think that's pretty close to right, that Stanton was rude with everyone from the hall porter up to the president. And yet, they worked so well together. From the almost, 2 months after Stanton is appointed, there start to be newspaper calls for Stanton's resignation. And Lincoln ignores them. He ignores them right up until the day of his death. Not long after his death, Lincoln's secretary, John Hay, put this well in a letter to Stanton. "Not everyone knows, as I do, how close you stood to our lost leader, how he loved you and trusted you, and how vain were all efforts to shake that trust and confidence, not lightly given and never withdrawn." So let's turn to April 14th, 1865, the night that Lincoln is shot. Stanton hears of the shooting of Lincoln and the attack on Seward at his home up on Farragut Square, and he rushes to Seward's house first, where he finds Seward in a bed soaked in blood with his face slashed by the assassin's knife, and half a dozen other people in the household stabbed and injured. As soon as he determines that Seward is likely to survive, Stanton rushes to Lincoln's side at the Peterson house not far from here. And he speaks for a few minutes with the doctors, learns that Lincoln won't live. He goes into the room immediately next to where Lincoln is dying and sits himself down at a table and starts work. He starts the investigation to determine who did this. He has his aides bring in some of the witnesses to what happened and takes their testimony. When it proves impossible to scribble out the testimony longhand, he sends out an aide and says, "Find me someone who can take shorthand." And soon a crippled War Department clerk by the name of James Tanner, who happened to live nearby, finds himself seated next to Stanton, taking shorthand notes as Stanton interviews these witnesses. But that's not all that he's doing. He's sending out messages to General Grant to get him back to Washington, to the local military commanders to have them, in essence, seal off Washington if that can be done, to question anyone who has arrived recently from Washington, and not just question them, put them in jail for good measure and ask questions there. As I put it in the book, he didn't announce that he was taking charge. He simply takes charge. Early the next morning, just after Lincoln died, Stanton supposedly says, "Now he belongs to the ages." I say supposedly because the first time those words appear in print is 1890, 25 years after Lincoln's death. And if you all think back to things that occurred in your life 25 years ago, and think how precisely you remember people's words, that's a question. If you look at all the various accounts that appeared within days of Lincoln's death, they don't mention Stanton saying anything. What they say is that immediately after Lincoln's death, everyone in the room got down on their knees, the pastor, Lincoln's pastor, prayed, and then people left. So I am reluctantly compelled to conclude that Stanton didn't say it. The most famous words that he ever said, he didn't say. The new president and the carryover Secretary of War, Stanton, got on well together at first. Indeed, it's remarkable reading the newspapers of late 1865 how popular Andrew Johnson was. North and South, Republican and Democrat, everyone claimed Andrew Johnson as their president. It's not until early 1866 when Johnson vetoes first a bill to renew and strengthen the Freedmen's Bureau, which is part of Stanton's War Department, and then a civil rights bill that a split becomes apparent between Johnson and the Republicans, of whom Stanton is now one. And as I mentioned at the outset, from Stanton's perspective, the key issue is the South and the continued military presence in the South. And again, the telegrams are right here in the building. He's receiving telegrams, one from Alabama describing a 14-year-old girl, quote, ravished and then both ears cut off. One from Texas describing 2 federal soldiers dead, shot in the road. No one knows who did it. And Stanton thinks, as do many, that this means that the Federal Army has to stay down there for a while to keep peace. Johnson, originally from Tennessee, feels equally strongly that the Federal Army has to get out. And finally, in February of 1868, Johnson has had enough, and he sends a letter to Stanton saying, "You are no longer Secretary of War. Lorenzo Thomas is now the Secretary of War." And you might say, well, okay, he can do that. He's the president. He can fire. But there's a little thing which doesn't exist anymore called the Tenure of Office Act, passed recently by Congress in an attempt to kind of shackle Andrew Johnson, which says that if someone's appointment requires the consent of the Senate, you, the president, can't fire that person without the consent of the Senate. So there's an uproar, akin maybe to what happened when the smoking gun tape was finally released by the Nixon White House. And within days, the House has passed a resolution to impeach Andrew Johnson, and then the action moves to the Senate for a full trial presided over by Chief Justice Chase of Andrew Johnson on these impeachment charges, which are all basically variations of the theme, you acted illegally in trying to fire Edwin Stanton. So where is Stanton while all this happens? He's in the War Department. He's holed up there because he fears that Johnson will try to sort of seize the War Department by force. So he basically sleeps, eats, does everything at the War Department for these months. He's not inactive. So for example, when General, now Representative Benjamin Butler needs help compiling a list of all the positions that are covered by the Tenure of Office Act, he sends a telegram to Stanton and says, can you do this? And Stanton puts his clerks to work over the weekend to compile the list. He's not troubled by the fact that he's using federal employees to aid in the impeachment of the federal president. No, he's determined, if possible, to see Andrew Johnson convicted and removed. As most of you know, that didn't happen. Johnson survives by a single vote in the Senate, a vote probably purchased with some of the defense money raised for Johnson's legal defense fund. And on the day that Johnson finally survives the last Senate impeachment vote, Edwin Stanton walks out of the War Department and, as best I can tell, never returns to that building where he had spent so much time. He spends a bit of the fall of 1868 on the campaign trail for Ulysses Grant, hoping, first of all, that Grant would be elected, because he thought the alternative was a disaster, essentially sort of electing a quasi-Southerner. but also hoping that he might get a new appointment. And he does finally get an appointment. In December of 1869, Grant appoints him, and the Senate confirms him to a seat on the United States Supreme Court. Sadly, Stanton's health didn't allow him to serve even for a single day. He dies within a couple days of that appointment. He was only 55 years old. Basically worked himself to death during the Civil War. So that is a short version of a long book, which I hope entices you, but let us take some questions. So there are mics on either side, and so in order to enable posterity to hear, if people would go to the mics rather than just shouting out from. So, all right, I think you're first here on the left.
Well, thank you very much. I'm Peter Dixon. I'm a graduate of Kenyon College.
Ah, okay.
And I published a book 10 years ago entitled Old Lincoln and Lincoln's Kenyon Men.
Yes.
There definitely was a Kenyon clique.
Yes.
Salmon Chase, his uncle, founded the college.
Yes.
I'd just like to make some observations that I think are interesting, particularly about Andrew Carnegie. I just checked your book. You mentioned him on page 55, but Carnegie made a very famous speech in honor of Stanton at Kenyon in 1906. I'll talk about that just briefly, but Davis, and I was able to prove this, he was Lincoln's kingmaker at the Chicago Convention. There are 8 telegrams in the Library of Congress. He flipped the Pennsylvania delegation to secure it. He basically stole the nomination from Seward for Lincoln.
I'm sorry, but do you have a question? Because I need to get...
Well, anyway, I would just say that, were you aware of Carnegie's speech?
Oh, absolutely. Indeed, you'll find it in the bibliography. It is quoted. And I love the detail. I mean, here you have this sort of famous major American figure, Andrew Carnegie. He remembers he was just a telegraph boy in Pittsburgh in the late 1840s, 1850s, and he remembers, handing telegrams to Stanton and sort of Stanton's nod, and then long after Stanton's death gives a speech at Kenyon, sort of summarizing Stanton's contributions. And as you might imagine, being Andrew Carnegie, he kind of emphasizes what you might call the industrial organizational contributions that Stanton makes during the Civil War. I think we're going to have to circulate through in order to give people a chance. So, all right, you'll be next, and then you.
Oh, just a quick question. Stanton and black troops. I understand that in 1862, what's the guy? Hunter, David B. Hunter, who was, I think, the commanding general of the South Carolina,
yes.
what was left of the Union in South Carolina, sent reports back to Stanton requesting to recruit black troops.
Yes.
And apparently Hunter was wasn't really well liked, as I understand it. Lincoln was cold to the idea of recruiting black troops in '62 because of the border. He was afraid he was going to lose the border states. So the question I have is, what role did Stanton play in the final decision to recruit black troops in 1863?
I thank you for that question, because I actually had intended to talk about that in my main speech and I overlooked it. One of Stanton's great contributions to the war effort is in persuading Lincoln to recruit black troops and then in making it happen, because it doesn't just happen of itself. And so even in 1862, not long after Lincoln overturned Hunter's proclamation, Stanton quietly authorizes another general down in that same part of the world, Saxton, to recruit up to 5,000 black troops. So it begins even in 1862, before the final Emancipation Proclamation, and it continues right up through the end of the war, a concerted effort. Stanton wants black troops not only because he needs the troops, but because he understands the way in which service in the Army will change the lives of these soldiers and their families. He's also very concerned about those who aren't going to be troops, the women, the children, the elderly, many of whom are living in difficult circumstances kind of at the edge of Union Army camps. And he authorizes, first informally, kind of aid. He organizes a commission to go around and sort of be his eyes and ears to tell him what's going on. And then he presses Congress for legislation to create what's called the Freedmen's Bureau, a bureau devoted to looking after the interests of the recently enslaved, on all levels. They're just basic care and feeding in some cases where they don't have economic circumstances, but education, so he is really at the center of the Union efforts both to bring in black soldiers and to take care of those left behind. All right, I promise to go over there to the right.
Thank you very much for your words. I'm finding the book to be fascinating, and I look forward to continuing to read it. One thing that I found particularly interesting is reading about Stanton's appointment to the U.S. Supreme Court. My question is, do you know if Stanton offered any indications about what he wanted his judicial legacy to be?
Yeah. How to put it? Not having been a judge before he was appointed to the Supreme Court, it's hard to say, here's this opinion and here's that opinion. But a number of the important aspects of the Civil War and Reconstruction were going to come up in front of the Supreme Court. And so he felt that the Supreme Court was going to, say, from 1865 through 1880, to play an important role, as it indeed did in interpreting and applying and judging the constitutionality of some of the things done during the Civil War and immediately after the Civil War. So he was very disappointed that Grant didn't nominate him kind of to the Supreme Court right out of the box when Grant became president, and he mounted a little quiet campaign making use of a bishop to and some members of Congress to lobby Grant before the appointment came in December of 1869. So back over here.
Congratulations on completing the book, a huge achievement. And two quick questions. One is, in terms of power over the Army, strategy generals, what they were doing, how powerful was Stanton compared to Halleck, the chief of staff?
Right.
And number two is, do you think he wrote the Dahlgren Papers, which apparently called for assassination?
Oh boy, we could go on about that. Okay. So the first question, Halleck, who gets brought from the West to become chief of staff and indeed technically general of the armies, I view as really sort of a glorified first-rate clerk. I don't think he was a bit of a disappointment to Lincoln and Stanton, who wanted him to play a more active role in running military strategy, but he basically ensured that the paperwork flowed, and that was important in itself. And the Dahlgren Papers, there was a raid on Richmond in the early January, February '64, in which Colonel Dahlgren, a family friend of Stanton's, is killed, and on him the Confederates find papers that suggest that the purpose of the raid was to burn Richmond and to capture or kill Jefferson Davis and the cabinet. The Confederates view this as critical evidence that Lincoln and Stanton are violating the rules of war. They're prepared to, sort of burn a civilian city, capture civilians. Unfortunately, we don't have here in the archives or anywhere else sort of a chain of correspondence that sort of prove that Stanton or Lincoln authorized these instructions, although I think it not improbable that Stanton, because of this family friendship, did have some conversations with Dahlgren. There's even a question about the authenticity of the papers, although I think most scholars today accept that at least this was Dahlgren's vision of what he wanted to do. The debate is how much higher in the Union organization this vision went. So I'll take it over here this time.
During the secession winter, President Buchanan, I thought, took the stand that the secession was illegal, but he could do nothing about it. Was that Stanton's opinion as Attorney General? And secondly, with the you mentioned the wonderful incident of moving the troops out of Virginia to Chattanooga. Around here, we're taught that that was all John W. Garrett's responsibility. What was the relation between Garrett and Stanton in that movement?
Those are two good questions. So let me take the last one first. Hope I remember the first one. John Garrett was the president of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. So he was one of, remember I mentioned that Stanton brought the railroad executives here to Washington at the outset of his term and said, look, we're going to work together. And Stanton and Garrett worked very well together through the war, including in the Tennessee troop movement. So one of the telegrams that's not in the official records that I thought was really nice, Stanton sends a message at about 11 o'clock at night to Garrett and a couple others saying, come here immediately. And then he has this midnight meeting with Lincoln. He gets back to the telegraph office, and there's a telegram from Garrett saying, when you say immediately, do you want to see me at 2 a.m.? And Stanton sends back a note to the headquarters of the B&O in Baltimore and says, no, the morning will be sufficient. But you can sense from some of the telegrams that Stanton and Garrett had already been sort of toying with this idea of a rapid rail movement, because another telegram that I found said, the response from Garrett says, fine, we'll be there early in the morning. I will bring with me the documents we've been discussing. And he doesn't say exactly what that is, but to me that suggests that they'd already been planning it. So Garrett and his people are absolutely critical. The B&O is the longest leg of that long journey. So they get great credit for it. But I think if Garrett were here today and say, well, who organized the whole thing, not just the B&O piece, he would readily say, my friend Edwin Stanton. And now I've talked so long that I've forgotten. Buchanan. No. Stanton and Buchanan disagreed quite a bit about what should be done in the secession winter, with Buchanan leaning towards giving up Fort Sumter and the other southern forts, and Stanton telling him to his face, if you do that, you will be a traitor, and your name will go down in history with that of Benedict Arnold. He was not a man to mince words.
Wow. Wow.
Over here, Larry.
I had an interest in the Freedmen's Bureau and its role in developing schools in the South and elsewhere, especially on the theological and normal schools,
Right.
Virginia Union and Hampton Institute and others. Most of those efforts, at least, involved a deep cooperation between Christian mission agencies. And I was just curious of Stanton's blessing of that, or affirming or helping that to happen?
So, I mean, maybe I should back up a bit and say that Stanton himself, although he didn't go to church every Sunday morning, was, you know, a Episcopalian. There was, throughout the war, in various fronts, not just in dealing with the freedmen, fairly close cooperation between religious organizations, charitable organizations, and the federal government in dealing with wounded soldiers, in dealing with the education of those sort of disrupted by the Civil War. And people didn't spend a lot of time sort of, you know, looking at the First Amendment and saying, oh, gee, I don't know if we can do this. I mean, they were willing and ready to work with whoever was there. So yes, the early education of the former slave children was really kind of a cooperative effort between religious groups and the federal government. Mm-hmm. And Stanton was very involved. Indeed, one of the bits of the book I love most, he goes down to the South in very early '65, and he spends the night in Beaufort, South Carolina with a couple of missionaries. And the young women recalled years later that Stanton sat by the fire with them and read poetry into the night. You know, these young Boston missionaries remembering 25 years later how the great tyrant war secretary knew poetry.
Nice, nice.
So over here.
Thank you very much. About the Johnson impeachment.
Yes.
Two questions. One, other than occupying the War Department, filibustering in the
Yes.
War Department, was Stanton public on the impeachment? Did he weigh in with senators? Was he much in evidence? And secondly, I recall that when John Kennedy wrote Profiles in
yes,
Courage,
yes.
he cited a Kansas senator
Ross.
who was the deciding vote,
Yes.
and dubbed his action such a
Correct.
profile in courage. Do you concur with that analysis, and would you describe that a little bit?
Sure. All right, so first, what else did Stanton do during the impeachment time? Was he involved in trying to persuade senators to vote against Johnson? Yes. So Stanton was friendly, for example, with Senator Fessenden of Maine. And Fessenden was one of the Republicans who was thought to be kind of on the borderline. It wasn't clear whether he was going to vote with Johnson or against Johnson. And so Stanton wrote some letters, and he provided an appointment for one of Fessenden's sons. And then when he hears that Fessenden is going to vote against Johnson, Stanton writes in some letters to his friends about the traitorous Fessenden. So yes, he is involved in the efforts to persuade senators. Senator Ross of Kansas, no less than President John F. Kennedy, included him in his Profiles in Courage book as a courageous senator because he had voted against the impeachment, and he was really one of the very last senators. As I mentioned earlier, it's pretty clear when you trace the money, as my friend David Stewart has done in his wonderful book about the 1868 impeachment. When you follow the money, to use that Watergate phrase, it's pretty clear that some of it winds up in the pockets of senators like Senator Ross. So I agree with David when he says of Senator Ross that he should not be included in the pantheon of our heroes. We should not place in that pantheon those who accept money in return for Senate votes. Over here.
These days, I'm not used to perfect cabinet members. I'm curious, if you were to identify the 2 or 3 biggest failings of Stanton, what would they be?
Oh gosh, 2 or 3 biggest failings of Stanton. Well, first comes to mind the sort of civil rights and in terms of arresting folks and leaving them to languish in prison. Another big mistake early in his tenure, he, like a lot of folks, he thinks that McClellan is about to capture Richmond and that will end the war. And so he suspends the recruiting process. And that was a big mistake because he should have recognized that when you had an army of nearly 1 million men, at that point about 750,000, you need a continuous flow of people in order to replace those who die or who desert or who get sick. And I don't know that it would have changed too much, but it was a serious error. I guess another sort of broad category would be in his relations with other cabinet members. He didn't play well with others, as someone said at one of my events recently. The Diary of Gideon Wells, which is the original of which is over at the Library of Congress, almost every page includes, and today Stanton ... I mean, there's almost nothing in there that's nice or positive about Stanton, and you can understand why, because from the perspective of Wells, the Secretary of the Navy, Stanton views the Navy as if it was sort of subsidiary to the War Department, whereas in fact it's its own, at that time, its own independent department. So, over here.
Hi, Edwin Grosvenor, American Heritage.
Hi.
When Jefferson Davis was caught, there was a rumor that he was caught in a dress.
Right.
And this very much interested Stanton, and he ordered the dress to be delivered to him immediately.
Right.
And when it arrived, it was only a poncho.
Right.
So my understanding is that he dressed up, he had a dressmaker's form, photographed, dressed up and photographed and given to the press. And I was wondering if that story was apocryphal or whether it's early War Department disinformation.
Early War Department disinformation. I think that the bit about the photograph is almost certainly apocryphal because photography was at such an early stage that I kind of doubt. I mean, certainly there were no photographers on the War Department staff. That just was not part of what the War Department was. There was Matthews Brady's studio here. What I do know is that, you know, he received the reports from Georgia that he was caught in women's clothing, and he simply relayed those reports to the press. So in a sense, what happened here in Washington when the clothing arrived didn't matter much. Everyone in America, quote, knew that Jefferson Davis was captured in women's clothing because of Stanton, perhaps imprudently, but you know, he simply was relaying, he made it a policy when news arrived from the front to relay it to the newspapers, and he simply followed that policy in this instance, relaying what he heard from, which was erroneous, but it was what he heard from those who captured him. So, and I see Mr. Swanson saying, time's up. So, thank you all for coming.
And folks, don't forget there's a book signing one level up, Archives Bookstore. We'll see you up there in just a couple minutes.